Hello. Good afternoon, everybody, and a very happy new year. And a really warm welcome to this webinar, which is all going to be focused on the future and how, as organisations, you think about the future in order to improve your resilience and impact. My name is Catherine Rake, and I'm from Lucent Consultancy, and we're a strategy consultancy that works in the charity and philanthropic sector. I'm going to introduce and let Sarah introduce herself in a minute, but just a couple of things to say. We know that whilst you can see us, you can't see each other. But in order to be super friendly and chatty as much as this format enables, please do say hi in the chat. And we are also seeking your questions as we go through this conversation, because Sarah very generously has said that she's going to freeform with the questions about how you plan for the future. So please do, as they come into your mind, pop those into the Q&A box, and we'll try to come to as many of those as possible. Just to say that our focus on the future originally, when we used future thinking in our strategy processes, it was really about testing out options, making sure organisations were resilient to different options. But one of the things we've noticed in the past 18 months is a huge increase in demand for this kind of work. And we're also seeing a change in terms of how it's working in the room. So it feels like it's unlocking conversations in a really fresh and new way. And that's what we're wanting to dive into today. And we thought no better way than to have on the line Sarah Mitchell, the Chief Exec of Cycling UK, who is, we only just closed the process yesterday, didn't we, Sarah? So it couldn't be fresher, really. And at the end of this, Sarah is going to be sharing her tips about how to do good futures work, having really thought about what it means for the for civil society organisations, and what the kind of change has been in terms of her own organisation, in terms of being adaptable to a really fast changing environment. So Sarah, I'm not going to introduce you myself. Do you want to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why you wanted to do this work in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Hello, everybody. As Catherine said, I'm Chief Executive of Cycling UK. We're quite an old organisation, almost 150 years old, membership, campaigning, and also community-based behavioural change cycling work. So we had a new strategy that started about 18 months ago. And really, since that strategy started, we recognised that the external environment had changed quite dramatically and was continuing to change, which I'm sure many of you have also experienced. We weren't bringing in the level of unrestricted funding in particular that we'd originally aimed to. So we were going to have to make some changes to our cost base. Politics had changed really dramatically, and generally the landscape that we were working with felt quite different to when we were originally planning our new strategy. And I think in that 18-month period, we'd also learned quite a lot about our organisation, about our capacity, our real capability, and also the level of resourcing that we had to be able to achieve some of the quite significant ambitions that we had in our original strategy. And so it felt really by the time we got to last summer that we were feeling very overstretched as an organisation. Some teams, particularly our support function teams, felt quite overwhelmed, unable to prioritise. People felt a bit spread too thin, and we weren't really able to support some of our income generating work streams. So it just felt like we were under quite a lot of pressure to make changes to our cost base, do a multi-year plan and budget. But what we didn't want to do was completely revisit our strategy. So we wanted to do this piece of work to think about where could we continue to have the best possible impact within our existing strategy and really focus on those key areas of work for us as an organisation and an environment that changed a bit. So it was a bit of sort of recognising the reality of the situation that we were in. So that's where we were when we started this work.
So we had a call, didn't we, Sarah? And you said, listen, I've got this issue. And I thought, actually, there's this package that we've been working on that would be perfect for this. I got this issue in terms of making sure that we're adapting to this environment, that the strategy is, our business plan is really focused, and that we use the the strategy basis, but to further prioritize. And I thought, okay, I've got the ideal package here, and it works both with your board and with your team more generally, because you had a board meeting as well as a series of team sessions upcoming. And I think, as a former chief executive, I think one thing to say is that the moments where you can really connect board and team together around the same problem are few and can feel few and far between. And this felt like an ideal opportunity to do this. But you'd already started that kind of conversation, hadn't you? And we were going to begin to share some tools, the first of which is the PESON. You'd already started the conversation about your external environment and the political, economic, social changes. I know we're going to get a slide shared in a sec. So do you want to just talk a little bit about the work that you'd done before we arrived in the room, Sarah?
Yeah, and I suppose another thing for us to say is that we actually got a few new trustees and a change of chair since we did our original strategy. So part of our motivation in this was getting our trustees back involved in and thinking about the sort of strategic direction for the organisation. And I'm sure many of you have used a pestle analysis before. We had as an organisation, but I think what we'd done before was very detailed. It tended to not be shared across the whole organisation, tended to be worked on by the senior team alone, and even the trustees would just have kind of view of it, but wouldn't really input into it. And so what we did differently about this was try and involve quite a few more people. I think that one of the challenges that I feel that I've faced as a chief executive, and I know that other people that I've spoken to in similar situations feel the same, is sometimes feels as though I'm the only person who's thinking about the future for the organisation. And now I'm very fortunate I've got a new chair who also thinks about that. But it did feel like everybody else in the organisation was doing quite a lot of firefighting. And so I think the real opportunity in this pestle that exercise that we did was to get views from across the organisation and also from different layers in the organisation. And sometimes that could be perhaps a little bit too detailed for what we needed, but I think crucially it involved a much broader group of people in the organisation and exercised their brains thinking about the external environment and our impact in the external environment. And I think one of the challenges for us is also the case doing a pestle was really to kind of focus on what are those issues in the external environment that really matter to us as a charity. So we got quite a lot of big issue is Trump and World War III, and that came up a lot. But really, we tried to kind of coach staff at all levels in the organisation to constantly be thinking about not just what are your interests and what are you personally worried about, but what are those issues under each of those different headings that are going to have the biggest impact for our charity and really shape what we should be thinking about over the coming months and years.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'd observed happened in that process, as it does everywhere, was the need to get out of your heads, collective heads, all of those very big existential worries that there are. And I mean, my goodness, going on in real time right now. And whilst that might affect your organization, like the situation unrolling now in Venezuela, there's an organization we've worked with recently where actually that is going to really affect their organization. For others, that's a concern, but it's not something that's going to impact the organization directly. So, one of the things that we did with you, both with your team, but also with the board, was that exercise around prioritization. So, just to say, really simple exercise. We literally gave people some sticky dots to vote with, and they voted across the piece in terms of figuring out which were the big drivers. But I mean, well, you tell the story, Sarah, but it was really interesting the degree of consensus, both within those different rooms and also across the rooms around that.
Yeah, well, firstly, people hated only having 3 sticky dots to vote with. They wanted at least 20, but the forced prioritization exercise, I think, was a really valuable one. We really expected to get very different perspectives from our senior team, our heads of department, and the board. So the really interesting thing was that actually the prioritization process showed that there was really similar views and actually quite a lot of consensus. So I think that was unexpected, but actually really helpful. It helped for us to see that there was a there became much more of a kind of agreed way forward amongst all of those different groups. But I think it was really important that all of those people had a chance to input, and we had a chance to see the range of different views, because I think it's also then helps us with communicating back to all of those different layers in the organisation that this was how they prioritised the different issues. So it isn't something that we've imposed as a senior team or as a board. It's something that everybody had some input into or rehearsed that thinking around, really. So that was really helpful in demystifying the process, that it wasn't just a set of priorities that we brought about, and then also really helped us, I think, with future communications with the staff around how we understand what they're prioritising and what they're worried about. So that was, I think, a really helpful exercise to go through.
Yeah. And so what that ends you up with is a big map in terms of all of those different drivers, but then the two really critical drivers. And from that, we drew a 2 by 2 matrix, which again, I think is going to pop on the screen any second, which showed how those two big drivers mapped one against another. And this is where I have a terrible confession to make, which is I don't know my left from my right or my up from my down. So this was true partnership, if I remember, Sarah, because we had to draw this literally in the room together in order to know the difference between horizontal and vertical, which I can't ever get.
And I feel like I've then drawn this subsequently many times with all different people across the organisation. But basically, the two big issues that we picked through the pestle process and then the prioritisation were economic. So, like whether the economy is doing really well or badly, really obvious one, but that massively affects our funding, our ability to sustain our funding as an organisation. And then the level of polarisation, political polarisation. We're a campaigning charity, so it's a huge part of what we do. So that kind of question around culture wars and political polarisation was the other big issue. So we drew those two axes based on those two major issues.
Absolutely. And what you end up with, which is what we always, so that what falls on these axes is different for different organizations, obviously. But what that means you end up with is two really clear scenarios. So one which is super positive and one which is super negative. So correct me if I ever get this wrong, Sarah, but scenario one is the super positive one where you've got healthy economy and a decrease in culture wars or a lack of polarization. Scenario three, the super negative one, where you've got a very weak economy and massive culture wars. And there is something about the rigor of talking both about scenario one, which often is people's baseline assumptions. Interestingly, that's one of the things I would say about charity sector and philanthropy organisations is optimism bias is very strong. So quite often people have an overly optimistic view of the current, or indeed some others, especially campaigning organisations, an overly pessimistic view of the current environment. So scenarios one and three tend to be familiar, but there is a rigour about making sure you attend to both of them equally. And then the other thing, which is super interesting in this process, is it throws up these two ambiguous scenarios. And again, this might be familiar, but just to say, people may well have heard people talking about future change now, these kind of acronyms. So there's an acronym that's very well used, which is VUCA, VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But actually, we tend to use the acronym tuna, which is turbulent, uncertain. And the reason we use tuna is for the N, which is novel and ambiguous. And one of the things about all of our organizations in these kind of super cycles of very fast change are that they're facing things that they've never faced before, hence the novel. And actually, the thing that is super difficult for organizations is managing ambiguity. So, ambiguity of scenarios where, for instance, you've got strong growth, but increased polarization, or the opposite, where polarization is, hang on, now this is where I'm going to get confused, especially without the strong growth, increased polarization, or the other, where you've got polarization increasing. No, I've got confused. Go on, Sarah. Tell me the other ambiguous scenario. Let's pop it back on screen and maybe I can remember.
Yeah, we had two. So we had a
Yeah.
kind of um, political polarization um, but of a healthy economy. And
There you
then we
go.
had less political polarization, but an unhealthy economy. So quite a negative economic environment. So we called them rich but angry and poor but happy. So poor but happy, I like to think of as the fairy tale sort of scenario.
Brilliant. Okay. And then obviously having mapped out those scenarios, as I say, the importance is about paying attention to all four of them. And and you can tell just by the challenge of even naming them that thinking about those ambiguous scenarios is something that is rarely done, but a really, really important part of the exercise. So the next part of the task, which I think again is going to flash on screen, was about brainstorming what does this actually mean for the organisation? What would be our big shifts under this? What would be the kind of operational opportunities and the threats? What are the big implications? So that we did this in kind of by breaking people into groups and literally getting everybody to spend the same amount of time on those different scenarios before we brought them together. So I mean, it would just be really interesting to hear how that process felt from your point of view, Sarah, and obviously also about then what it led to.
Yeah, and I've tried doing scenarios work before around futures in charities. And my previous experience of it is that it's been incredibly time consuming, really complex. And I think a lot of staff, including senior teams, have really struggled to get a grip on it and understand what they were supposed to do. So I think the way that we did it in this process, where it was quite time constrained and we tried to simplify it as much as possible, I think worked really well. So we did this exercise with the board, with the senior team, and then with our broader leadership team, which is our heads of department. And then we did that with Catherine and with Lucent. And then we independently did that with the rest of staff through a series of roadshows. So practically everybody in the organisation has been through a scenarios workshop, which is quite ambitious. But because of the way it was structured, it was actually quite possible to do that. And maybe because of the sort of organisation that we are, we've got lots of creative thinkers, people really got into it. And so exploring those different scenarios was, I think, really rich. And I think one of the pushbacks that we got around the ambiguous scenarios was that people didn't feel they were realistic. They couldn't. I think there was a lot of sort of pushback from our campaigners in particular saying it's never going to happen. There's not going to be a world where the economy is doing really well, but you've got increased political polarization because it's really linked to the economy not doing well, which we challenged. And also, I think it really gave us an opportunity to say to staff, it's not. This isn't a prediction of the future exercise. So they don't actually need to be realistic scenarios. It's a way of exercising our brains to think about the future and different potential scenarios. So that was a helpful exercise, I think, to go through for all of us to just loosen up our thinking and really think about what those different potential opportunities and risks could be. And I think as we went through those scenarios, people recognized that whatever scenario we might end up in the future, nothing is forever. And so one of the real insights I think we all came to through this exercise was an organization-wide recognition that agility was really important for us because whatever we decide on now, it's really important that we continue to adjust and change as the external environment changes and our experience of it does. And it was also really evident that there are probably different bits of the different scenarios that are apparent at the moment and that we expect to happen in the future. So I think gradually people started to realize it was the kind of the components of the scenarios and the exercise that was important rather than the scenarios themselves. So, and I think the final point just on the scenarios was we really recognized that there were actually opportunities in all of those scenarios, even the ones that looked super depressing. I mean, particularly for a campaigning organization, we looked at poor and angry, the one where the economy is not doing very well and there's loads of political polarization. And our trustees looked at that and thought, oh, crikey, there's nothing there. We're going to lose loads of funding. It would be a terrible scenario. But of course, all our campaigners popped up and said, well, actually, this is brilliant for campaigning because we need our campaigners to be angry. And that's where we get more money from our major donors. So I think that's just one example of the sorts of opportunities we started to draw out of some of those different scenarios which we took forward. And I guess the insights that we drew from those scenarios before we went on to the next stage was that organizational agility is really crucial for us and something that we really need to focus on. And that ability to be able to scale up and scale down according to different environments and different funding regimes. And I think it also really helps us to have a much better appreciation of what our strategic assets are as an organisation and those points that really differentiate us in the market. So those were the things that we came out of from the scenarios before we went on to the next stage, which was a bit more of a thought experiment, Catherine. I don't know if you want me to talk about that.
Well, before we get on to that, I just think just to pause a minute on this point about this is not about prediction. It's a way of rethinking and reshaping the organization. I just think there's so much in what you're saying there, because I think a lot of people think future scenario work is about, kind of, I suppose, a sort of clever exercise, if I could call it that, an analytical exercise where you're kind of going to be making bets, but actually you're talking about it in a very different way, and it's given that different perspective in the organization. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think previously when I've done it, it has felt like a more removed and theoretical exercise.
Mm,
And there is I think previously when I've done this, people even refer to the idea of doing scenarios and then deciding on your big bets. What are the big bets that you're going to make in your strategy going forward? Whereas I think what we got out of it were in any of these four scenarios, what would we need to have as an organization? What we'd really need to focus on? And I think that's what we
mm,
took forward. We sort of looked at all of them and thought, none of these is really going to come true, but probably elements of each of them are either true at the moment or will be true in the coming years. And with that in mind, are there just some really obvious things that we need to tackle as an organization to make sure that we can have the best possible impact that we can have as a charity? And I think
mm,
that became quite clear for us, and that's what those insights were from that whole exercise. Plus the educational process for the whole staff team, because I think there's just something really helpful for me as a chief executive to involve a broader group of people in having those thoughts so they're capable of doing that level of challenge. And I think also for staff development to just really help people to think more about the position of the charity in the world. That helps all of us if we have more people in the organization thinking about what are the other opportunities for us to have a great impact, really thinking creatively about that and tapping into that hive mind of the whole organization is a really positive thing, I think.
And I think that that's one of the reasons, that kind of permission that you've said and that permission to challenge is one of the reasons that we've seen the conversations about the futures unlocking something a bit different. Because not only does it give you permission, but it requires you to talk about the taboo. And quite often within organizations, the very pessimistic is the taboo, or the really big challenges to your underlying operational model are the taboo. And as soon as you've lifted the taboo, as you said, through that kind of structured process, the creativity suddenly emerges. And actually, as soon as you've looked something straight in the eyes and said, oh, actually, now we've spent a bit more time thinking about it, actually, there are opportunities for us here. And it would require us to think again differently. That's the creativity. And it requires you, as you were talking about, to go right back to core purpose and be really clear about your core purpose. So, in terms of taboo, one of the things we did was really actively lift the taboo through the kind of thought experiment piece. So, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what happened in the room, and then maybe I could reflect a bit about what I observed changing through the course of that conversation.
Yeah, we did a thought experiment, which I think carries a bit of a kind of don't necessarily do this at home health warning because I think in the wrong environment and not communicated properly can cause panic. But we had a discussion in our senior team about what we would do if we lost all of our statutory funding, which we don't expect to happen, but we realistically expect a significant decrease in future years, not in the next 3 years, but in the future. And just for kind of clarity, probably 2/3 of our funding is from large national statutory contracts at the moment. So our thought experiment was more about what are we outside of those big chunks of funding? And if we didn't have that, what would we be? It forced us to really think about our core purpose as an organization within that strategy that we had set. What could we continue to do? What are the assets that we could really exploit? And if we think that's a possibility, what are the opportunities for us? And I think the senior team responded to it better than I'd expected. And after, a little bit of sort of slight anxiety at the beginning, it really helped to liberate that thinking by sort of, I suppose, as you put it, Catherine, sort of looking the worst in the eyes, because it helped us to think about what are things we're actually doing and what could we do more of, and what would those opportunities be. And in a way, that's quite liberating because you're no longer constrained by the expectations of the funding that you have at that time. And it helped us to know that we have got a plan. Actually, we're not so dependent on that funding that we couldn't continue to do the stuff that's actually of huge value. And it helped us to see some other opportunities in the work that we could do, but also opportunities in the work that we're doing at the moment that perhaps we could exploit further.
Yeah, and there was something again about this isn't prediction, so none of this is, as you've said, is going to happen. It's about the what if, and taking that additional stretch. So it's deliberately extreme, and you have to tough it out a little bit to keep to that kind of extreme version of it in order to discover some things about the organisation that you want to carry into the more everyday scenarios, if you like, the less extreme scenarios. Because I think unless you do that additional stretch, you're just going to fall back into the status quo, as you said, that busy, 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 responding to the immediate challenges. And there's something about the magic that happens in those more challenging scenarios, which enables you to think fresh about the your kind of daily business. And I think the other thing that I would observe about why and it's really interesting links to some and by the way, I should have said to all of our participants, we're going to email you after this with a list of resources, and I'll make sure to add this in. But there's a book that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment called Immunity to Change, which talks about the need to shift and revisit your assumptions as being key to change. So we all think change is, it's about our kind of willpower and we just need to get better at it. But actually, what they point out is unless you change your underlying assumptions, you won't change behavior within an organization. And I think that there's something, as I say, I've been thinking a long time about this, probably my entire professional career, but there's some real truth in that, which is that in order for people to actually shift, they need to think afresh about the external environment. And that is in fact, quite a neutral way to think about how you shift your assumptions. Because if you root it within the practice of the organization, that's where you get the close down and the defensiveness about, well, this is what we've always done, or this is how we deliver, or this is what our funders require. So actually saying, let's revisit our assumptions about the external world makes that conversation about what got you here won't get you there. We need to think about how we change our practice rooted in the external world rather than linked to internal practice. So I'm probably not articulating this as clearly as I will in a couple of years' time, but there is something about this process not only lifting the taboo, but allowing people to revisit their assumptions about the world they're operating in. I don't know if that is resonating with you, Sarah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's also really difficult to do, I think. And I think in a way, these sort of thought experiments and the scenarios helps to loosen up that thinking a little bit to get people out of their everyday. But it does require a team to dedicate some time and some resource away from their desks, really properly with the emails off, coming with a fresh thought, ability to and time to take to really think through some different scenarios and lift themselves out of the day to day. And I mean, I think that was challenging for us, but I think the team generally rose to the challenge on that in what was nevertheless very, very busy autumn for us.
Yeah. And I mean, just to say, and for the purposes of those listening to this, although it is time that it's we talk a lot about this, about it's intense time, kind of focus time, not time heavy. It's not a huge kind of, it's not months and months in the diary. A lot of these sessions are done in an hour and a half, 2 hours. So in terms of actual diary requirements, it's about getting people's minds and the right atmosphere in the room, isn't it? Rather than a huge amount of time from the diary. But
Yeah, I think that's right. But I think if you're leading that process, my experience of that is outside of that time, I needed to find some time to really think about it and really dedicate that time to thinking things through to make sure that we were getting out of it what we needed as an organisation. But I think you're right, it's not huge amounts of time, it's just making sure there are those proper thinking moments, which I'm sure many of you also experience in your busy diary. Just having a half hour here or an hour there isn't necessarily conducive to concentrated thought and decision making. So really making sure that that was a priority was really important, I think.
Brilliant. Okay, so I can see that we've got one question coming up in the chat, and we are going to move on to the questions in a sec. So please do keep popping your questions in the chat, and we're going to open this up in a second. But before we do this, it would be really helpful to hear a bit more about then what happened. So having done this futures and future scenario process, we moved into another process about kind of what is the focused work going to look like over these next couple of years. So Sarah, do you want to talk that through?
Yeah, so the process helped us to really reaffirm our core purpose as an organisation, which is around building really positive perceptions of cycling in the long term. And it really helped to clarify some of our strategic assets, which I think are the combination of having a very loyal membership base, which obviously is a nice, really reliable stream of unrestricted funding, but also combining that with an amazing community reach, which not many membership organisations have the luxury of. And then we came up with what we're calling two strategic pathways. Quite difficult to articulate, but we've come up with two that within our strategy are going to help us really focus on the things that we think we need to do next and in the next 3 years. And one of those is being much more focused around our audiences. So we've done lots of audience research, we have lots of personas that we use, but we realize there are some sort of bread and butter things around what we do with those audiences that's a bit of a missed opportunity for us, which is a bit of we think is relatively low hanging fruit, but is really important for us to tackle in terms of getting the right focus right across the organization and all of our activities. And then the second one is around our our regional and local focus. So we're calling it a gradual move to being a more networked organisation. So at the moment, we're a UK-wide organisation. We try to influence 4 different governments, but increasingly a lot of the work that we need to influence is going to be at combined authority level, regional level. And we have lots of local contacts which we've not drawn together. So the second part of our prioritisation will be around that move from being very national focused to having basically making much better use of our local and regional assets to become a more networked organisation. So those are two sort of pathways of ways of prioritizing our work. And the big piece of work we need to do now is integrate those into our strategy and use those to help prioritize our work and business planning for the next 3 years. So we'll be not pivoting to do a whole load of new work, but looking at our priorities and the areas of work that we want to do and really focusing on those things that help us deliver those two strategic pathways. So it helps us to say no to some stuff, hopefully, and to make some thoughtful cuts, but it also helps to open up some avenues for real sustainability and hopefully really increased impact in the medium to long term for the charity. Hopefully.
And I think there are a couple of things that have been really inspiring actually about the landing on those two pathways. One was that it came out of, again, super clear, and it was that thing you really gave permission to the process because we went into a workshop with the senior team and the directors about this and about what the priority areas were, really not knowing what the answers would be and how much convergence and divergence there would be in the room, but actually everybody was really clear that these two were the two. It didn't quite come out like that, did we? We kind of built it in the room together, and there were sort of sub items. But actually, by the end of the session, it was like a two and a half hour session. Everybody were like, actually, no, there are these two really substantial pieces of work to be done. And the other thing that I think, so it was built with a lot of people in the room and together, and that real power of the hive mind. And then I think the other thing that's been really exciting about seeing those two develop is that they cut right across the whole organisation. So everybody owns an element of that. And I know you're beginning to think about how you embed that. So, in the governance, so that, some unusual suspects are sponsors and all of that sort of stuff. But already, I think the fact that everybody can see elements of their work reflected in those two pathways, I think is super important. So we're going to move on to some questions. I'm going to start with one of the questions that was submitted in advance about technological change, and then I can see some questions coming up in chat. But Sarah, before we bring in the questions from our participants, and it's really interesting because I was reflecting on this as well, that actually, technological change, the AI as and the increase in AI actually for all of our clients hasn't come up as one of the major drivers, and it didn't come up as one of the priority drivers for you either. And it would just be really interesting to hear a bit more about why you think that might be and what your interpretation of that is.
So, AI in particular, and the speed of development in AI, definitely came up in our pestle analysis, I think, in all the different levels that we discussed it. And I think the reason that didn't become one of our axes was simply because it's it's almost, it's not about the technology itself, it's how we respond to it and adopt it and react to it as an organization that we thought was important, because there are all sorts of different aspects of technology that may or may not be important to us. It's difficult to know at the moment. So it's a bit like the scenarios in that it's going to be important, but you don't know quite which way it's going to go. And some of those things are going to be more or less important to us, both in terms of campaigning around, for example, autonomous vehicles, and in terms of running the organization, in terms of agentive AI. So I think where it was reflected in our work was really around that insight on agility as an organization,
Mm,
and to some extent our discussions around how our culture as an organization needs to change.
yeah.
And so I think that staying alive and responsive to those changes and having that openness as an organization and thoughtfulness to kind of consider what are those opportunities and risks around technological change on a regular basis. So to be able to, and I mean, not that, and I don't mean that we should just wholeheartedly adopt every bit of AI that comes through the door, but more that we have the opportunities to review and take stock and think, is this something that really works for us or is it not? Because there are so many potential bits of technological change that may be coming our way. There's either the risk that we, on the one hand, completely ignore it and just go stubbornly ahead with a strategy
Mm,
that we've developed before any of this technological change started, or on the other hand, that we get pushed backwards and forwards between lots of different potential opportunities that we then don't really have the resources to realize and make work for us as an organization. So I think it feeds into that agility question. How do we
yeah.
make sure as an organization that we continue to be open and responsive to that changing environment around us? And I think this might come on to a question actually that Heather's got in the Q&A, Catherine, which is around organizational agility. Because I think
Hmm.
it's a really good question, because you can just say the word agility and of course it sounds great. It's actually quite difficult for some charities to be able to achieve that. I think an opportunity that we've got as a relatively small organization, we're 140 staff. So, not tiny, but, smaller than many, um, is to recognize the importance of continuing to make sure that we know what our core running capability is as an organization, and we can scale up and scale down, which sounds a bit brutal, but we've already had to do that a couple of times. We've had to scale up for a big piece of work and scale down again, and to make sure that we continue to assess our strategy in the light of a changing external environment. So, having done this exercise 18 months in, I think it's really brought home to me the reality of having to evolve a strategy and to constantly reassess and make sure that it's on track and that the organization is structured in the right way to be able to take advantage of those different opportunities in the external environment, or to be able to support itself with any potential risks in the external environment. So that's both in terms of how we're structured as an organization, but also I'd say crucially in terms of our culture as an organization and how we shift that. And Catherine, we've had quite a few conversations through this process, haven't we, about how the culture needs to change around the assumptions we make as an organization, and the way that we do things might not necessarily be the way that we want to keep doing things in future. And I think we need to be flexible and keep that flexibility in our mindset as well as in our structure as an organization.
Definitely. And I think one of the things to say is that, everything that's surfaced through this process has some potential value. It may not be the big drivers that you identify, and in terms of holding on to that simplicity about making sure you only identify two, but we have seen through this process as well issues being raised, and then organisations thinking actually we need to dedicate some time and space to that separately to make sure that continues to be part of our ongoing thinking. So digital strategy, or a culture change strategy, or an organisational practice strategy, whatever it might be. I think there's a difference between saying something matters, and we need to deal with it. I'm saying actually this is the biggest driver for us as an organisation, and I suppose that's what the rigor of the scenario process is. Yes, it's simple, but definitely not simplistic. It's simple, and it's a route into those conversations about how you might need to adapt. It doesn't give you a comprehensive view of every single thing that's going to affect your organization, because that's not the purpose of the exercise as is. But it's important that, as chief executive, that you kind of say, actually, no, there's an issue that I want to plug in a different way for the future thinking about the organization. Okay, so some great questions coming through. Can I let me just group these couple. The first one from Heather. Thank you, Heather. Very, very prolific question. I like that. About how you're going to continue your future thinking through your strategy implementation and kind of practical ideas. And then a question there from Colette about how you used, in inverted commas, your board of trustees in the process, and anything that kind of surprised you, and anything that you've seen shifting in their roles as a consequence. So what next? What next? We've done some of the immediate
Yeah.
what next, but what next?
So we have a strategic planning process in the organisation, which we are shifting actually as a result of this exercise. So we're doing multi-year planning at a high level, and then each year we'll review that and do more detailed business planning. So slightly different approach for us, a bit more high level. So we'll incorporate some of this thinking into that process, and we'll repeat doing the pestle every year, so that we make sure that we're keeping on top of those things that are kind of external facing at an external level. I think one thing that we haven't got in place, but I will want to do in future, just on a kind of practical basis, to make sure that we continue to have the quality of thinking and also the input across the organisation, is making sure that we have some kind of engagement across the broader staff team in some of that reviewing of the strategy. So I think, in answer to your question, Heather, we have some pieces of the puzzle in place for the future strategic planning, but because we're really at a very early stage, we've only just completed those strategic pathways pieces of work, and we're just about to go on to our business planning process. We haven't got all of those structures in place at the moment, but that's kind of definitely the next stage that we will do, because I think, as I said, we all recognise that this is not something that you do as a one-off. It's something that you have to keep checking in on in order to make it sort of meaningful and continue to be relevant.
And the board, and how you've used
Yeah.
the board, and anything that surprised or changed in their role as a
So we
consequence.
did we did involve our board of trustees in this process. So we've got a slightly odd board of trustees. I mean that in obviously the most positive possible way, but we have a lot of member trustees who are elected from our membership. So we have a slightly, probably not the most strategic board in the charity sector, but I'm sure many of you have also had that challenge. But this was a great opportunity to involve our board, because it enabled us to involve them at the right sort of level. So we got them involved in the pestle, but we didn't give them a blank sheet of paper. We gave them some of the views that we got from the senior team and from the leadership team first. So they were sort of set at a certain level, so they didn't start talking about the operational detail. And actually, we had some really good insights from our board on that because they really helped us to understand some different perspectives, more external perspectives. So I think from the first time, really, in my experience of working with this board, we actually really used them for their external perspective, and that was really helpful. And I think it really helped them to get much more engaged in what we were trying to achieve through our strategy process in a way that we hadn't really managed to do through, for various different reasons, through our original strategy development. So it surprised me in that we got that quality of conversation from many of our trustees. It helped us to understand who are those trustees we can really go to on some of those different areas. And has it changed their role in any way? I mean, I guess I would hope that it's helped push them to that more strategic level of thinking and really thinking about those external opportunities and risks, which should be a lot more of their sort of bailiwick. Um, and I think it's also really helped them to see that some of them that they have real expertise that we really want to draw on in the organisation, rather than the sort of default of just talking about their passion for cycling, which, you know, is
Mm.
lovely, but doesn't really help us as a senior team in delivering our role. So I think helping them to see that they have very specific skills and expertise that they're potentially bringing to the board, and we can really make use of them. So I really hope that that will continue to have an impact on their interaction with us and with the organisation in the future.
Yeah, and one of the things I'd observe for your board, but also other boards that we've worked with through this, is quite often they come from very, very different professional backgrounds. And you've got a kind of group of, 8, 12, 15 people whose professional backgrounds, couldn't be more different. But actually what that does is as you say, is it gives them a perspective on big external drivers that is quite unique. So that kind of brainstorming, very helpful. But then I think that prioritization exercise, which just like the team, the board really dislike having, only 3 votes, enables them to think about, okay, well, that might these might be the two drivers for my day job, but actually for this organization, what are those two big ones? And again, I'm not sure how often they come together and build that collective view about, okay, what really matters here for the organization in hand, rather than what am I carrying in terms of my day job, because you've got a lot of busy executives on your board, as many board of trustees do, where actually, if you get them, especially in a busy moment, what they're going to do is reflect back what's happening, in their day job, rather than what's happening for that organization. I don't know if that feels familiar.
Yeah, and I think with member trustees as well, they'll reflect on their own experience of their cycling world and their cycling membership rather than their sort of strategic view of the organization. So I think it's a good kind of nudge for them to be able to do that. And I think really was a way in which we were able to kind of positively reinforce those sorts of contributions.
Definitely. And I mean, one of the things in terms of what it's changed is, I suspect it's probably too early to say because that was only done in the autumn last year, but it will give you a point of reference. So again, having done this for a little while now, sometimes what's most helpful is you can refer back and hold the thread to what you're doing now, back to a moment that they were all part of. And again, creating those kind of moments where you come together as a whole team and you're all part of the same process, everybody on the same level, everybody making the same contributions, can be hugely significant in terms of reminding trustees, who at the end of the day are volunteers dipping in and out of it, actually we had that conversation and this was the consensus view at that time.
Yes, definitely. We call it bloodying their hands. So they're taking some responsibility for the decision making, and we can remind them of it at the appropriate time.
No one will ever forget that, that metaphor. Okay, so I think, unless there are any other questions coming through, we did trail at the beginning the fact that you were going to share some tips, Sarah. So if you were going to do this again, or if there are chief execs of other organizations there thinking, actually, how should I run this kind of process? What would be your top tips for others?
Yes, of course, I'm happy to share these. And these are obviously just based on my experience. So other people might have a totally different experience. But I think important things for me were to sort of bear in mind that there is no perfect external environment for any organization, and strategy is about not controlling that or attempting to shape that external environment, but really thinking about those future potential futures for the organization. Helps us to think about the strategy and how best can we organize our own resources and assets as a charity to be able to really address that situation. And I think one of the reflections that I had is always to approach this exercise thinking there are always opportunities, and they may just change as the external circumstances change. And then linked to that, I think the second point is that evolving a strategy is absolutely essential, and changing tack in a strategy isn't just okay, it's actually part of that strategy. And I think as a chief executive who set a strategy 18 months ago, I think I came into this with a certain nervousness that changing it now would make people lose confidence in me and in the strategy overall, because I sort of lovingly nurtured this strategy, launched it, sold it to the organization, sold it externally. But it's so important to recognize that when a strategy could be working better for the organization, we have to adapt it. And for us, we've really framed that in the organisation as being part of a continuously learning organisation. It's been a really positive experience. And then I think my third point on that would be, as we've talked about already, that this is not an exercise about predicting the future. I think thinking about it like that can just put a huge amount of pressure on you, and it can feel quite constraining. So remembering that and really reminding others that it's not a future prediction process, it's not fortune telling, is really important, because that really opens up that creative thinking. And then I had a few tips about the actual process and the sort of practicalities of it itself. And one of those is about just trying to keep it as simple as possible, because our colleagues just don't have very much time to engage with this. And so crafting that process so that whenever they do engage, they can we can maximize their thinking and their input for really short stretches is really important. And having that pestle process, the prioritization process, and then those very short scenarios, which we timed really tightly. So it's kind of pushing people to think quickly was really important. And then, as I mentioned briefly, thinking time is really important in this process. And I recognize that can be really difficult to find in these very fast moving environments that we find ourselves in. And certainly for me in the autumn, I had a big transition in my senior team. We had lots of gaps in the organization. But nevertheless, I think the thing that I always think about it is, if we as leaders aren't thinking about the future for the organization, sadly, probably nobody else is. And so the challenge that I think Catherine has pushed at me a couple of times is, what's more important than this? And who else, if not you? And so I think that thinking time, probably the most challenging part of this whole experience, is crucial. I think having a sounding board is really important. So we were fortunate enough to be able to work with Lucent on this. And I know that not every organisation will be able to afford to do that. But having a fellow thinker on that journey is really important. So whether that's a chair or a trustee or another chief executive in a different organisation, I think that can be really helpful to have that external perspective and challenge. And I found that really pushed me and the team to think about things differently. It's really difficult to take yourself out of your own experience and your knowledge of the organization. So having somebody a bit external to really challenge you, I think, is really an important part of the process. And then two other things. One, just keeping faith through a process that sometimes can just feel like it's throwing up so many different options. You feel like you're in a kind of option soup. When there's so much information, I think it's important to just keep the faith that eventually those will coalesce into some practical things. And some people are more or less comfortable in that space of uncertainty. So that's maybe a kind of reassurance for anybody going through that process. If you stick with it, it will sort of sort itself and those things will rise to the surface. And then finally, bringing other people along in the process is really crucial. So we're a hybrid organisation. We don't have a regular office where everybody meets. We have this very unusual member elected board. So building that buy-in and support across all of those different stakeholder groups is really important, because the result of this process will mean we're stopping doing stuff, which is never popular. We'll be introducing more change, which also is never popular. And we'll be asking people to prioritize. And we needed to get people to practice that thinking and really bring them along in the process so that they felt they were part of it. So it takes more time to do that. But when I set out on this process, I knew that was a priority for us. And I would really urge people to make that really important part of that process if you're going to go down this track. And that's
Brilliant.
it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a complete pleasure working with you through this process, and thanks everybody for attending today. Just to say that we will follow up with some resources if people want to read or watch their way into this area. Then there are some resources that we recommend. There is a flexibility about this approach, which is you can use it at any time through a strategy review process, as you say, right in the middle after you've done a couple of years of implementation, or indeed if you're planning to do a process afresh. The external environment is changing very fast, so it's always a great time to think about what's going on in the external environment and what really matters to you. And to just reinforce your point about bandwidth, Sarah, there is a very limited bandwidth, not least because we're all distressed and concerned about what's happening in the big wide world around us. It couldn't be more challenging. She says that. Let's wait to see what happens next. But it's hugely challenging. But actually, this time pays huge dividends, and being able to do it in a way, as you say, where you keep faith in the process, but it's structured enough and certain enough that you know you're going to get to a resolution, I think is a really important part of it. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. It's been a fascinating conversation, and a huge thank you to you, Sarah, for being so open with your learning from the process.